60 school kids telepathically contacted by an alien entity. A family left with radiation burns from a burning diamond in the sky, and an imaginary ghost had somehow started throwing tables across the room. These are real paranormal encounters that are hard to explain away. On September 16th, 1994, something happened at a school in Zimbabwe that still has people talking today. It's easily one of the most famous UFO cases in history. It was morning recess at the Ariel school, just outside the city of Rua. Suddenly, dozens of kids claimed they saw this weird craft descend from the sky and land right near the schoolyard. And then, a couple strange beings stepped outside. The kids all described the exact same thing. They said these figures were small, had giant black eyes, wore dark clothing, and were very clearly not human. Some of the kids even said the beings communicated with them without ever opening their mouths, almost like they were placing thoughts and feelings directly into their heads. What makes this story so hard to shake is the sheer number of witnesses here. We're talking about 60 students, all claiming to have seen the exact same thing. Right after it happened, investigators interviewed the kids one by one before they would have had a chance to talk to each other and sync up their stories. Even a Harvard psychiatrist named John Mack went down to interview them. He was a guy who spent his life studying weird encounters. He walked away convinced the kids were telling the truth. Their stories just seemed too consistent to be a prank. Deep in the basement of an old farmhouse in a quiet English village called Scole, a group of people spent years trying to make contact with the other side. Starting in 1993, 4 researchers decided to hold regular seances in this basement. But they weren't just looking for cold spots and feelings of being watched. They wanted physical proof, and they claimed they got it. So during these sessions, they said glowing lights would float around the room, objects would hover on their own, and disembodied voices would speak to them from empty corners of the room. But the eeriest part, they'd put sealed, unopened rolls of photographic film in the middle of the room. When they developed them later, there would be messages and images printed on them. The claims were extreme, to say the least. So the group actually invited outside scientists and investigators to come watch. Some of them were from the Society of Psychical Research, which is a group that's been involved in paranormal research for over a century. A lot of the investigators who sat in on these sessions admitted they couldn't outright explain what they saw. And everything was documented over several years, making the Scole Experiment one of the most heavily corroborated and researched paranormal investigations in history. In 1967, a law office in Rosenheim, Germany started experiencing weird things, and nobody really knew why. The building wasn't old, wasn't even all that creepy, it was just a boring modern workplace, but the office equipment started acting like it had a mind of its own. The phones would dial numbers seemingly on their own, light fixtures on the ceiling started swinging wildly back and forth, light bulbs literally exploded, and heavy furniture would slide across the floor. It got so bad, the office work basically ground to a halt. The owner of the firm, a lawyer named Sigmund Adam, was convinced there was a massive electrical issue. He called in power companies, phone technicians, and eventually actual physicists from the Max Planck Institute to figure out what was broken. But even with all their testing equipment hooked up, the weird stuff kept happening. Eventually, investigators noticed a pattern. The chaos seemed to peak whenever a 19-year-old receptionist named Anne-Marie Schneider was in the room. She was going through a really rough patch. She was dealing with a messy, broken engagement and just hating her job. It seemed like whenever Anne-Marie walked down the hall, the lights behind her would shatter. Investigators concluded that some kind of force was feeding off her repressed stress and causing all the weirdness. Seemed like a stretch, but in January 1968, Anne-Marie finally quit, and just like that, the phones went quiet, the lights stopped swinging, the office went completely back to normal. And the case is often referenced as a classic example of a poltergeist, where all this crazy energy seems to feed off one specific person. In 1977, a totally normal house in North London became the home of the most famous poltergeist case ever documented. It started when a single mom named Peggy Hodgson called the cops because she heard loud banging inside her walls. She told the police that her kids' dressers were also sliding across the floor by themselves and toy bricks were flying through the air. The weirdness quickly centered around her 11-year-old daughter, Janet. Witnesses said Janet started speaking in this incredibly deep, raspy, gravelly voice. It sounded almost like a gruff old man.
Anybody there?
No.
Who's there?
Doctor,
Doctor who?
Bruce Chase is here.
The voice claimed to be a guy named Bill Wilkins. who actually had died in a chair in that very house years before. Naturally, journalists and researchers flooded the house. A photographer named Graham Morris and an investigator named Guy Lyon Playfair actually moved into the home for months to document all this stuff going on. They caught strange knocking sounds on tape, took photos of toys seemingly floating. The recordings of Janet's voice are still some of the most chilling pieces of the case. Whether you think it was a massive hoax or a real haunting, it's easily one of the creepiest paranormal cases in modern history. On a chilly night in 1973, two buddies went fishing along the Pascagoula River in Mississippi. They were just hoping to catch some fish, but ended up in the middle of one of the most famous alien abduction stories of all time. Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker said they were sitting by the water when a giant floating football-shaped craft silently descended right above them. They claimed that three bizarre creatures floated out of the craft. And I do say bizarre, these things did not look like your typical gray aliens. They had wrinkled gray skin, but no necks, pointed carrot-shaped things coming out of their ears and noses, and crab-like claws. The men said they were paralyzed, floated into the ship, examined by a giant mechanical eye, and then dumped back into the riverbank. Terrified, of course, they ran straight to the sheriff's office. The cops figured they were either on something or just messing with them. So, to catch them in a lie, the sheriff left the two men alone in an interrogation room and secretly turned on a tape recorder. Well, instead of snickering, bragging about their prank to each other, the tape caught them whispering to each other in what sounded like genuine confusion and horror, talking about how they almost died.
I passed out. I passed out. That's the first time I ever passed out in my life. You checked the new medical records.
Had they experienced an actual alien abduction, or was it some kind of hallucination brought on by who knows what? There's no way to know for sure, but the tape did convince the sheriff and a lot of people who've heard it that, at the very least, the men did believe that they saw something. On a dark road in Texas back in 1980, three people drove straight into a nightmare that eventually led to a massive lawsuit against the US government. Betty Cash, Vicki Landrum, and Vicki's young grandson Colby were driving home when they saw a massive diamond-shaped object hovering right above the trees. It was blasting blinding light and shooting columns of fire out of the bottom, blocking the road ahead. They stepped out of the car and got out to look, thinking it was maybe a plane crashing, but the heat radiating from the object was so intense it actually softened the dashboard of their car. Betty tried to get back inside, but the metal door handle was just hot to the touch. Then they saw a fleet of military helicopters surround this flying object before escorting it away. Within hours of getting home, all three of them got incredibly sick. They were vomiting, their skin started blistering like they had severe sunburns, and their hair started falling out in clumps. They eventually sued the government, arguing that the flying diamond was a secret military project gone wrong. The case was ultimately thrown out because the military refused to admit the craft or the helicopters were theirs. To this day, though, the case has never been solved. Back in 1972, a group of Canadian researchers decided to try something really odd. See, instead of looking for a ghost, they wanted to see if they could actually build one from scratch. So the Toronto Society of Psychical Research sat down and invented a guy named Philip Aylesford. They didn't just make up his name though, they gave him a whole tragic backstory. They decided that Philip was a 17th century English nobleman who fell in love with a woman that he just couldn't be with, leading to him taking his own life. Remember, Philip was completely made up. He never existed. But once they had their story straight, the group started holding weekly seances. They sat around a table, dimmed the lights, tried to talk to their imaginary ghost. For months, nothing really happened, but then things did start getting weird. During one session, the table started moving. First, it was just little nudges, but then it started rocking, tilting, even lifting completely off the floor, so they say. This experiment kind of blew a lot of people's minds because the ghost they were talking to was, again, totally made up. It's 1952 in the tiny town of Flatwoods, West Virginia. A group of kids playing football outside see a bright, fiery object streak across the night sky and appear to crash on a nearby hill. The kids ran and got one of their moms, Kathleen May, and the whole group headed up the dark hill to see if it was a plane crash, but when they got to the top, they didn't find any wreckage. Instead, they saw a pulsing, glowing ball of light, and their flashlight beam hit something standing under an oak tree, or more like floating. They saw this towering 10-foot creature with a bright red face and giant glowing eyes. The group screamed, dropped their flashlights, and scrambled back down the hill. Then over the next few days, several of them got really sick with raw throats, they were vomiting, and they blamed it on the weird gas up on the hill. Over the years, people have come up with a few different explanations for what the witnesses saw. Some researchers think the creature may have actually been a barn owl, with the darkness making it look stranger than it really was, and that the object in the sky was just a meteor. But I mean, a 10-foot owl shaped like a humanoid creature in a cloak? It does seem like a stretch. And that has been our video. I'll catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next one.